Hi, this week I want to follow up with something I mentioned very briefly in my video on scholarly consensus. Click the link up there if you want to watch that one. And that is what scholars call the Synoptic Problem. To start off with, when scholars refer to the Synoptic Problem, they're not trying to say there's an actual problem in the text itself. It's just referring to the Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, those three Gospels have so much overlap of content that it's as if we could kind of see them all at once. It's really clear that there is some kind of literary relationship between those three Gospels, but it hasn't always been very clear as to what the nature of that relationship might be. So what is the Synoptic Problem? You don't have to read very long in Matthew, Mark, and Luke to realize that there's a huge amount of overlap in the material between them. Now, that in itself may not be that surprising because they're all setting out to tell essentially the same story. Now, what makes that fact so interesting is that when these three Gospels are similar, they're extremely similar. When they're different, they're noticeably different. And the presence of the Gospel of John in the mix of all this means that it's very clear that even at the time, it was obvious that there was more than one way to tell this same story. It's important to realize that none of these things are new. People have noticed them for a long time. The only question is, what exactly do we do with it? What may not be clear to everybody just by reading the Bible is that Greek is a very different language than English. Greek is very fluid in its word order. Now, in a language like English, you pretty much have to have all of your words in basically the correct order if you want it to make sense. But in Greek, there's a lot more wiggle room about what order the words in a sentence show up in. With that being said, it's important to realize that when the synoptists each write basically the same story, they are often the very same for large chunks of text, down to the very same words being told in the very same order. Given the nature of the language and that the word order is so fluid, the most likely explanation for these large chunks of word-for-word identical text is that people are working off a common shared written source. You'll find the general scholarly consensus is that Mark wrote his gospel first sometime around the fall of Jerusalem, and that Matthew and Luke each had a written copy of Mark that they used, although they supplemented it with other material, most notably being from the document that we now call Q, based on the German word for source. It is worth noting that we don't actually have any real archaeological evidence for Q as a source, but it's simply the name that we give to material that is shared in both Matthew and Luke, but is not found in Mark as well. I want to reiterate what I said in the previous video, and that is, just because this is a scholarly consensus doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. It just happens that it's one particular explanation for why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar, and why Matthew and Luke have some similarities that are not shared by Mark. It isn't like there haven't been other solutions proposed to this problem. It's just that this is a solution that many of the people who have thought about it long and hard think is the most likely interpretation. It's possible that it's wrong, but so far it's the best that people who have studied the New Testament deeply have been able to come up with. On one level, that's really all the Synoptic Problem is, an acknowledgement that Matthew and Luke seem to have drawn upon Mark and some other sources and edited them together for new people in a new context. But, you might say, this might cause a big challenge. After all, it sounds like that what this is saying is that both Matthew and Luke were not so much authors of their Gospels, but editors. And some people have felt that this plays against this notion that they were divinely inspired. Now, I don't find that to be a problem. I don't feel like it raises that issue. And I want to share a few thoughts as to why it is that I think that. First of all, when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were each preparing their Gospels, they were doing so for a different context. They weren't writing them with the imagination that all three of them plus John were going to be compiled together in a larger book that we now call the Bible. And so what that meant is that they were writing to different groups of people, and so the readership would not necessarily overlap between those books. And if you were writing, trying to prepare the Gospel for an entirely new audience, you might not be tempted to reinvent the wheel from the ground up. You might want to take advantage of all the resources you have at your disposal. And so if Matthew and Luke were not only writing to people who were totally different groups from each other, but also in totally different groups than the Gospel of Mark was written to, then the fact that they overlapped their material would make absolutely no difference to their readers. We need to remember that context makes a really big difference. I've had over the years friends who have been in ministry with youth in the inner city, and so I have suggested that if they were to take out of all the stories and all the passages we have about Jesus in our current Bibles and compile out of those the story of Jesus for those inner city youth, and I were to do the same project, but my target audience was United Methodist pastors in Iowa, it's very likely that even though there's a huge amount of overlap in the material and all the major points in the life of Jesus would be the same, there would be a huge difference between those two documents. The very stories that we select and the order in which we arrange them has a huge role to play in how the whole book, how the whole document comes off. And that brings me to the other major reason why this question about authorship versus editorship doesn't bother me. Editors have the ability to completely reshape the material they're working on. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, famously edited down a whole bunch of other people's books in order to extract from them the best parts. And he famously took Matthew Henry's commentary, and Matthew Henry was a strong Calvinist, and he basically just edited down by deletion, not by adding in other things, and he ended up reducing it to his own notes on the Old Testament. And by the time he was done with it, there was no hint of predestination anywhere else. It's clear that even though literally all the words in it are Matthew Henry's, it is very distinctly John Wesley's book. I have found that the synoptic problem and some of the major ways people have attempted to solve it are oftentimes some of the most disturbing ideas that people encounter either in seminary or when they hear what seminary-educated people have to say. I don't think it has to be taken as an undermining of biblical authority. If we understand the importance of context and the nature of what an editor really is correctly, then I think that we will see the consensus solution to the synoptic problem for what it is, an attempt to try to work out what the literary relationship is between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In the weeks to come, I hope to make another video that takes this kind of the next step and helps us to work through how it is that we can read the three synoptic gospels on their own in such a way that takes each of them seriously and prevents them from kind of blurring into one another. Well, that's all for this week. If you have any questions or any topics you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. If you have found these videos interesting or engaging, please consider liking and sharing them on social media. And if you'd like to watch them or subscribe to the YouTube channel where these things are posted, you can be found at /tstevik1. Thanks very much. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.